Diets are very fad-based, and maybe the biggest fad right now is intermittent fasting, particularly for guys. But there are definitely some downsides that go with it. So I'm going to talk about diets a little bit. I'm going to talk about what fasting does and doesn't do very well, and what some of the difficulties are for people if they want to consider going down the intermittent fasting route as a means of weight loss. So if we roll back the clock about 200 years, the first diet I've ever found that was widely fad-based was this diet called Banting. It was named after a guy, William Banting. And it basically was a removal of a lot of starchy carbohydrates and a lot of processed foods. So you couldn't have dessert, you couldn't have pastries, you couldn't have alcohol, you weren't allowed to eat a lot of potatoes and bananas. So really high sugar, high carb items were restricted from that diet. And that gets us rolled forward all the way up to about Atkins, actually. And if you think about Atkins, which was sort of like the 60s and 70s, Atkins was a response to processed foods and high carbohydrates and the, I'm going to say, marketification of produce. So we went away from produce and we started buying processed items, and Atkins got us towards a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, getting rid of a lot of processed foods. And then you roll forward a little bit more, maybe about another 30 years or so, till the mid to late 90s, gets you up to paleo. And paleo is a total negative response to processed foods, saying that we should only be having foods that were available during Paleolithic times when we were hunter-gatherers for best health effects. And you see, all along the way though, we're trying to remove processed foods. So I think if we're looking at diet in general, we need to say that the number one thing we should be concerned about is removing these heavily processed foods, because every diet focuses on removing processed foods. That's the number one thing. So what is processed food? So if you think about the amount of money that goes into an Olympic athlete getting drug tested, for instance, I guarantee you that Kellogg's and Nestle and all these other companies are spending 10 times that much money paying a scientist to create a taste in a lab that you can't avoid. So there is a magic combination of sugar, fat, and salt for snack foods that make things nearly impossible to stop eating. So those slogans like "once you pop, you can't stop," and "bet you can't have just one," "you can't say no," all these different slogans that go with snack foods, they're telling you the truth. They have deliberately designed those foods, it's called hyper palatable, to be impossible to resist. And when you look at some of these foods, and I did a video about this recently on my Instagram, bread has 4 ingredients, but if you go to the supermarket and you read the ingredients on most of the loaves of bread in your supermarket, you'll find they've got 15 to 20 ingredients in them. And you see, as food has become more modern and safer, it's become far more processed. So what we should be pushing for is what I call single ingredient foods. So that's things like where you look at it and you see it's a chicken and the ingredients are chicken. You shouldn't look at chicken and see that the ingredients are chicken and soy and lecithin and emulsifiers and flavorings and additives and salt and all these different things. It should just be chicken. So the more we can get to single ingredients foods and the more we can get away from processed foods, all the diets are going to be healthier regardless of which diet you choose. And that's the truth about all diets, is they all work the same way. They all work by restricting calories in some way. Now, if we look at a paleo diet, we're saying we're resisting processed foods. If we look at Atkins, we're reducing the amount of carbohydrate that we eat because we're eating predominantly protein and fat. So these diets work to restrict macronutrients. So carbohydrate is one of 3 macronutrients, or carbohydrate, protein, and fat are the 3 main or the only 3 macronutrients. There's kind of an optional 4th as alcohol, but alcohol doesn't really form part of any fat loss plan. And then we look to something like veganism, carnivore diet, and you can see they're excluding whole food groups completely. So vegan diets are going to completely exclude animal protein, so that's a macronutrient. Carnivore diets are going to exclude carbohydrate completely. So again, they're reducing calorie intake by reducing consumption of a macronutrient. Now, intermittent fasting is just reducing the time window you eat in. It doesn't actually reduce the amount of food that you're going to eat or that you can eat, but it's reducing the amount of time you've got to eat it. And that creates the biggest problem for me with intermittent fasting. So when we look at intermittent fasting, and let's just use a 90 kilo, 200 pound man as an example. So general rule of thumb for protein intake is 1 pound 1 gram, per pound of mass. So a 200-pound guy needs 200 grams of protein. A 60 kilo, 135-pound person needs 135 grams of protein. A 300-pound guy needs 300 pounds, and so on. However, during dieting, and this is any dieting, there will be muscle loss. You can't avoid muscle loss or loss of lean tissue while dieting. There's always going to be some. To prevent it as much as possible, there are two main things you can do. One is resistance train to encourage the body to maintain muscle tissue, but the other one is actually increase your protein intake slightly, and it's not unusual to see people recommended 1.2 grams of protein per pound of mass. So now our 200-pound guy needs to eat 240 grams of protein per day. Now 240 grams of protein is about 800 grams of chicken, because it's about 30 grams of protein per 100 grams of chicken. So now if we look at a typical intermittent fasting diet with a 6-hour eating window, I'm going to tell you I need you to eat 800 grams of chicken just to get your protein requirement for the day. And that's before you eat any vegetables to help you go to the toilet and to make sure you get valuable micronutrients to keep your system strong and healthy. If you've ever eaten 800 grams of chicken in one sitting, I'll tell you what happens. It's one of two things. One, it's either impossible, you can't eat it at all, so now you're getting insufficient protein, which almost guarantees muscle loss, or two, you're so full from eating that much protein, you can't eat anything else. And again, we've now got this secondary negative impact from no fiber, no carbohydrate for workouts, no micronutrients coming from vegetables. So straight away, that creates a problem for me. And when you look at the amino acid profile of people in intermittent fasting, what you see is that there is a definite dip in what's called essential amino acids. So essential amino acids are amino acids that without which we will die. So we very much need these. We get them from main sources of protein, but in people in intermittent fasting groups, because they're not actually getting adequate protein intake, their levels of essential amino acids are dropping. That predisposes them to loss of muscle tissue. As I've discussed in other videos, that means that they're going to speed up the aging process, and this is a negative thing. We're trying to preserve as much muscle mass as possible as we age. If you're engaged in a diet that's actually encouraging muscle loss, that's a negative from a longevity and health point of view. There is a slight rebound in that at about the 12-hour mark when you enter a fast. However, that's probably due to muscle cannibalism and breaking down of your own muscle tissue, further exaggerating the loss of muscle loss that you've already seen from your fasting diet and insufficient protein up till now. When we look at studies on fasting, one of the biggest problems is people talk about all these longevity benefits, the health benefits, this thing called autophagy, which is when the cells are replenishing and regenerating themselves. The vast majority of studies done so far are not actually on humans. Okay, so it's very problematic because what you see in rats doesn't translate to humans. I've been doing this job for a really long time. I can't tell you how many rat studies I've ever seen translate into human benefits of the same level, but I can tell you that the number is less than 1. Right? I have never seen a rat study correlate to a human study as a 1-to-1 relationship. So just because we see it in rats doesn't mean we're ever going to see the same relationship or the same benefits in humans. Out of the few studies that have been conducted on humans, there are none that have been done so far, as of my research this week, that were actually done with a random control group. So the studies have already got some question marks relating to them, whether or not we can take the rat research and apply it directly to humans, or even in the kinds of humans that we selected in the first place to conduct these studies on. What I can tell you is that when they've done human studies, and we've looked at the difference between a lean person, and it really isn't that lean, it's someone with a normal BMI and someone with what counts as an obese BMI, is that the difference in what happens to resting metabolic rate is quite profound. So in a person with a normal BMI, when they enter a fast, the first 24 hours, their metabolism actually speeds up. So this is important because if you actually wanted to lose fat, you would be encouraging your metabolism to be going as fast as possible all the time. Someone with a normal BMI experiences that. Someone with an obese BMI, so this is an abnormal BMI, their metabolism slows down. and actually slows down by as much as 8% within 48 hours. So you see a slowdown of about 7% within 24 hours, and then it totals out to about 8% within 48 hours. And this is significant because if you think about the normal intermittent fasting protocol of 18 hours of not eating and 6 hours of eating, you are re-entering a 24-hour fasting period every single day. You are slowing down your metabolism every single time you enter into that fast. And the reason I bring this up as important is because the kind of person who's most likely to seek out a fasting diet is overweight. I don't actually know anyone who's lean and is lean year round who follows a fasting diet. All of the guys I know, like myself, who are lean year round, just follow a normal moderate eating plan, eating the right quantities of food all the time. The people I know who've been attracted to fasting have all been overweight. And yet, when we look at the research, and again, this is the little bit of research that actually directly applies to humans, we see a metabolic slowing during this period where they enter the fast for the first 24 hours. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't really want my metabolism slowing down at all as I get older. I want my metabolism to be racing along as much as possible because I'm feeding it regularly, I'm sleeping well, and I'm exercising regularly because that's going to help me stay in shape as long as possible. If we keep following this path of metabolic slowing, we're going to get ourselves into this really difficult situation where you're having to eat 1,000 calories a day to try to lose weight, and that's obviously not going to be very helpful at all. One final thing that goes with fasting is that it does actually see a response in increased ghrelin. Ghrelin is basically your hunger hormone. So when you have high levels of ghrelin, you will have high levels of uncontrollable hunger. Fasting has actually led to increased ghrelin output by people in that overweight or obese category. So you're setting yourself up both through a metabolic slowing into an overeating period because your metabolism has slowed. Now when you overeat, you're more likely to stack more fat back on, and this cycle will continue every time you enter that fast, starve yourself, increase ghrelin, and then actually end up in a very difficult situation later on where you've gained fat and have a slower metabolism. So when we look at all the different things between the metabolic slowing, the drop in essential amino acids, the difficulty with trying to get in adequate dietary protein while in your eating window of your fast, you can see that there's actually probably much smarter ways around this. A lot of the publicized benefits like decreased inflammation, increased longevity, haven't been proven in humans at all. And in fact, there are studies to show that a regular eating pattern where you eat 3 or 4 times a day has actually led to much lower levels of inflammation than a fasting diet has. And there's actually studies to back that up. There's no studies to back up fasting leading to lower levels of inflammation or growth hormone production or anything like that. So again, rat studies don't equal human studies. And the human studies that we do have got some really negative effects to show for people in the overweight category. So if you're looking to try fasting, maybe have a second think about it. There are probably smarter ways to go about fat loss that won't set you up for failure or for a bigger problem later on. Now, if you like the content, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Go to my website, www.peakperformance40.com, and join our community where you can hang out with guys just like you looking for the best health and fitness information to keep them alive and performing well as long as possible.